How's everyone doing? Last session of the day. Everyone feeling good? Everyone feeling strong? Yeah. Okay. One response is all I really needed there.
It's all you're going to get.
It's all I'm going to get. So in this session, what we're covering is how security works for apps up in Office 365. None of my demos worked until 45 minutes ago, so it was one of those things where I had to rebuild my machine this morning, and things weren't working in the hotel, but now I think I got all my demos working. I got lots of slides for you. Who the heck is the guy on the stage? My name's Ted Pattison. I'm a SharePoint MVP. I'm a technical author. I've been around since the 1800s. Maybe you've read some of these books right here. This is the new SharePoint app book for 2013 that you see out there. There's a book signing tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Me and a whole bunch of other folks, mainly Scott Hillier, are writing the Inside SharePoint 2013 book. I own and run a company called Critical Path Training. We do hands-on training. We do classroom remote training. If you want to take classes from your work or home that we teach over in the States, we have courseware. Okay, enough about me pimping myself, on to the topics at hand. So let's start with just app authentication in SharePoint 2013. Just kind of curious, how many people went to Paul's session at the very beginning of the day? We talked about security. Okay, so there's really three different styles of security for apps. Internal authentication, and I'm going to cover what that is. There is OAuth, which is the way that our server-side code authenticates in the Office 365 environment. That's what I'm going to focus on at the second part of the session. And then there is S2S, which is basically what we use for on-premises for provider-hosted apps, which was the focus of Paul's session. How'd you do, Paul? If you had to rate yourself, A, B, C, or D? A plus? Okay. Paul is a great speaker. Just ask him. Okay, let's keep going. Anyway, let's start with this basic question. What is a security principal? Okay, well, it's an entity. It's understood by a security system. It's an entity that gets established that you can then go and configure permissions so that this entity has accesses to a specific resource. So we kind of think of the Active Directory user as the most obvious example of a security principal. Well, how about a user who's authenticated with FBA or some of the other different styles that identity providers provide that are compatible with SharePoint? Those are security principles. An Active Directory group, an FBA role, a computer in an Active Directory domain. And as of SharePoint 2013, apps become first-class citizens. They got authenticated, and they get promoted to basically first-class security principals. Now, we had these issues back in SharePoint 2010. We write farm solution code, and we've never really been able to get to a point where someone who owns the farm can put a farm solution in place and control the farm solution so it can't do what the current user can do. The current user can do lots of stuff. The code in your farm solution can do lots of stuff. And what many of us learned as developers, if the user can't do what you want to do, you basically just make that call to run with elevated privileges, and all of a sudden you run with godlike permissions. So that's the Pandora's box of SharePoint development up to this point. That you really have to know a lot about a developer before you're ever going to put his or her code in your environment, because it can do whatever it wants. So for corporations that hire employees as developers, that's okay. But when I'm taking just some code because I need a business solution, it's the last minute, I go to the internet and find something, we're not going to let that kind of code run with such godlike permissions. Okay. We also had the sandbox. You've probably heard a little bit about the sandbox, but I think now we look at the sandbox nostalgically, as something like a one-hit wonder that basically was just there for one particular version of SharePoint as the Microsoft strategic approach, and now this new app model has replaced the sandbox as the way developers are going to write code, but yet the people that are in charge of the SharePoint farm get to control exactly how much that custom code from the developer can do. Okay, now let's start with user authentication. So users get authenticated in SharePoint as of 2010 using this claims-based model. Now, user authentication in SharePoint 2013 works for the most part just like it did in SharePoint 2010, except in SharePoint 2010, a lot of us kind of thought claims mode, classic mode, yeah, I'll use one or the other. But now there's this big strategic move to get rid of classic mode and to do everything with claims. Why is that important? Well, Microsoft's introducing some things that only work in claims mode, that don't work in classic mode or don't work in any type of supported way. Give me an example. SharePoint apps are only going to work if your web application is in claims mode. So the idea is when the user gets authenticated, whether it's Windows authentication or whether it's FBA or I'm using some external identity provider, such as Windows Live or Google Sign-In, at the very tail end of the authentication process, we have all these different identity management systems, yet on every single web server, there's a security token service. And that takes whatever security token that we've created because of a unique type of identity management system and puts it into a standard form, which is what we call a FedAuth token. So the FedAuth token is just an in-memory claims token. But basically, everything that we're going to see, at least with internal authentication, is going to rely on that FedAuth token being there. Now, we have app authentication, and that is brand new to SharePoint 2013. Obviously, previous versions, there's no apps, so there's no app authentication. So the first thing to see is that app authentication is only supported in CSOM and REST endpoints. So if you just hit a page and you're not going through a CSOM or REST endpoint, there's no way app authentication is ever going to occur. Okay, now we had Eric Schups who did the REST talk. We had Todd, remember Todd? Who did the CSOM talk? I'm afraid that I just appear in slow motion after coming on stage after Todd. I will go to, okay. So the basic premise is if you want app authentication, you have to call in through these entry points. Well, what about if I create my own custom web service and I put it inside there, want my app to call in through there? It's not supported. So the endpoints that support app authentication are baked into SharePoint 2013 as the standard CSOM and REST API entry points. Now, there are 3 different ways that SharePoint can authenticate an app. First one is internal. We're going to cover that quickly because it just works. You can understand all the technical details behind it, and it might be a waste of your time because it won't really help you. It just works. It's really the external authentication when you have server-side code in a provider-hosted app or an auto-hosted app. That's when things get tricky because we have to use external authentication, which means that our code is required to obtain a special type of security token known as an access token, and then to pass that token in a special header anytime it makes a CSOM or a REST API call. Okay, just a little bit of App Fundamentals 101 review. We have 2 basic categories of SharePoint apps. We have SharePoint hosted apps, and the idea is that when you install a SharePoint hosted app in a target site, which we're going to call the host web, SharePoint will automatically create this special child site underneath, which is called the app web. Now, one thing that's important to note about SharePoint hosted apps is that it has no server-side process. All the custom code that you put into your SharePoint hosted app has to be JavaScript. You could argue if it's late at night, no one's looking, sure, you could use Silverlight or Flash or something like that, but for the most part, it's JavaScript and the different JavaScript libraries that we have. Now, the other type is a cloud-hosted app. Now, cloud-hosted apps break out into 2 different categories, provider-hosted and auto-hosted, and I'll talk about what those are in just a second. But the idea is that a cloud-hosted app has its own server-side process, its own external website that in the SharePoint terminology we refer to as the remote web. And one of the big advantages there is that it can have client-side code because it can serve up pages with JavaScript, but it can also have server-side code. And so that's where I can start writing my C# code and leveraging my .NET framework skills, where you can't do that at all inside of a SharePoint hosted app. Also note that the architecture doesn't have a dependency on the .NET framework or ASP.NET. So you could create your remote web using any type of web platform technology that you want. That being said, if you use ASP.NET 4.0, and Visual Studio, you just have a huge leg up on lots of code that you don't have to write and lots of security specs that you don't have to go through to basically learn how to build your own security tokens and manage them. Okay, now also remember that every single app has a start page. And the idea is that once we have created and installed an app in a target site, users in that site are going to be able to go and find the link, which we call the app launcher, and click it and basically be redirected to the start page. And inside the SharePoint hosted app, well, that's going to be in the SharePoint environment. Inside of a cloud hosted app, that's somewhere else on the local network or somewhere out on the internet. Okay, now, let's do our first demo here. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to create just a simple SharePoint hosted app. It looks like I was testing and left something up there. So let's go ahead and say new project. And we'll create this SharePoint hosted app. And this one we'll just call Bob. Now, you have to have an Office 365 tenancy if you want to do testing against Office 365. And many of us had preview sites, which we got for free last July. If you're getting in now, you either have to pay for your Office 365 developer tenancy, or if you have an MSDN subscription, you can go in there, activate it, and get something for free. But the long and short of it is that you're going to have some particular site. Now, another thing about working with SharePoint apps is unlike SharePoint solutions, there is a remote development story. On my machine, I got Office and Visual Studio. There's no local farm. So everything that I'm doing here is basically going up against some site in the Office 365 environment. You'd also be able to create an on-premises farm and stand a site up there and do remote development. And remember, the one trick there is that there is a special type of site introduced in 2013 known as a developer site. And the one thing that distinguishes a developer site is it allows Visual Studio to reach across the network and install the app for testing purposes. If there's a team site over there, I can't do remote testing. I have to go through the full publish install on a team site. Okay. Now, back here in Visual Studio, I'll just basically say, go ahead, finish. If I had not authenticated, Visual Studio would basically bring up some dialogue saying, what is the name of your tenancy, what is your username and particular password. I'll put those things in place right there. And as you probably have seen, once you create a SharePoint hosted app, they give you all the hello world code that you need inside there. And I realized I didn't create a SharePoint hosted app. And I can't believe, Paul, you didn't correct me. Ted, don't do that. You're going to get in trouble. Paul's like, oh, this is going to be great. Okay, so let's go ahead. And now,
How do you know I'm really Paul?
oh, are you the Eggman or something like that? I've always wanted to use that joke in England. Okay, so let's keep going here. This time, when I create this particular app, let's go ahead and switch over to SharePoint hosted app. Look at that, SharePointConfessions.com. That was hard to get. I had to pay $10,000 for that URL. Okay, let's keep going here. But basically, I'm just going to hit the F5 key. And what this is going to do, it's going to build my app into a .app file. It then does what's called side loading. Visual Studio knows how to basically push the app into an entry point in my developer site. And it just gives me a quick way to deploy the app. Once again, I've already kind of done all the username, password, and cached my credentials. So once we've done that, things work for free. And then we'll go look at our Paul app right inside here. And we've got Hello World. And this is actually using CSOM to call back into SharePoint. I mean, if I take a quick look at this code right here, let's go back here and take a look at this. This is just kind of the code that Visual Studio supplies us out of the box. And so here's some code that uses the client-side object model. Look at all the authentication code. Okay, I'm just kidding. It's not there. Authentication happens for free with client-side code when you write it on pages inside the app web. And how is that possible? Okay. So now that we've kind of been through that first thing, let's talk a little bit about the app web. The app web is created when the app is installed. Now, SharePoint hosted apps have to have an app web. You have no choice because there has to be a start page, and the only place that a SharePoint hosted app can put it is inside the app web. Now, when you create a cloud-hosted app, being a provider-hosted or an auto-hosted app, you don't get an app web automatically, but sometimes you need one. There are several different developer techniques, in particular using something called the cross-domain library, which allows your pages that are served up by the remote web to call back into SharePoint and use internal authentication, so it just works. And so what's a little bit funky about that is you have two different projects, and you have to go back to the app project and add anything. You can add an empty element, but it's just triggering adding something to the app project when you have an auto-hosted app or a provider-hosted app, now I'm feeling like Todd, that basically triggers the creation of the app web inside there. And if you want to use the cross-domain library, you might find that it's failing. Oh, I haven't created the app web yet. So remember that cloud-hosted apps, the app web is optional, but sometimes you need it. Okay, now let's talk about the URL that's created for the app web. Now, if you look at the URL to my particular site, you might think that the app web would just be created as that URL and then whatever the name of your app is. And it turns out that that would not work. We need this level of isolation. So every time you install a SharePoint hosted app or a cloud hosted app that creates an app web, the SharePoint host will create a domain on the fly, mainly so it can detect any time a call comes in through the app web. And the idea is you install an app. Behind the scenes, SharePoint has this app management service, which has a database that basically says, okay, here's app, name Paul, and here's the URL. And anytime it sees some JavaScript coming in through the REST or CSOM APIs, it just does the mapping, saying, oh, this URL maps to this app. We're going to automatically authenticate. Now, what are the pieces there? There's 4 parts. The first part is the name of your tenancy. Mine SharePoint Confessions, and I have quite a few. Second one is the app unique identifier, and that's just basically something that's created on the fly. The next thing is the app web hosting domain, which is going to be specific and standard across an entire farm. And so up in the Office 365 environment, that's always going to be SharePoint.com. When you configure support for apps in a local farm on premises, you can make that anything that you want. And of course, we probably want to run it through HTTPS. And so there's a lot of SSL certificate management that you have to deal with, especially when they're just creating all these domains on the fly. Generally, you have to use a wildcard SSL cert. And if you have religious differences with that, it's time either to leave SharePoint or change your religion. Okay. And then finally, the last part right there is just the name of your app. Okay, now, once again, internal authentication just happens. And typically, it's when calls come in through the app web. And obviously, when you're creating a SharePoint hosted app, all your calls are coming in through the app web. But even in the cloud hosted app scenario, if you use the cross-domain library, you have this library where you're basically creating some JavaScript object and calling execute, and they do all the work of basically pushing it in through there and getting some things that come back from that URL, and then using some very advanced JavaScript to basically bring it back inside of an iframe and to basically register JavaScript events with the post message API, and then they have JavaScript on the other side that kind of reaches inside there and pulls out your content, and then just kind of hands it to you. So it's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes to make that cross-domain library work. But once again, it just works for free. Okay, now we have these 3 different models. We have SharePoint hosted apps, and then 2 different variations of the cloud hosted app. The provider-hosted app is something that you can use in the Office 365 environment, or you can use in an on-premises farm. And the AutoHosted app, as you probably heard about in some of the earlier sessions, is something that is unique to Office 365. And the idea is when you install your app, not only does it install the app, it automatically stands up the remote web using some private infrastructure that exists between the Office 365 environment and Windows Azure. Okay, now, once again, with a provider-hosted app that many of us are going to be creating, why? Because I'm a manly man or a womanly woman and I like writing C# code, and I just can't get by with just JavaScript alone. So with a provider-hosted app, it's kind of nice during development that you just hit the F5 key and they just use localhost 44330. But when it's time to deploy, you've got to stand up the remote web somewhere on the internet or somewhere on the local network. Okay. Also, if we have a auto-hosted app, well, I still have that remote process that I can run server-side code in. The nice part is that me, the developer in my company, we don't have to worry about deploying and standing it up and managing it. It's automatically done behind the scenes. Okay, now, when you have server-side code, quite often, we don't have an app web, or if we do, we don't care about the app web. It's really the host web. That's where the action has to take place. That's where my app wants to reach back to create a bunch of document libraries or a bunch of lists and pre-populate them with data. But for me to do that, I have to call back into SharePoint with an access token. And what we're going to do is talk about how we're going to create these access tokens. Remember that when you call back into SharePoint, whether you're calling through the app web or the host web, or maybe your host web is a child site, maybe you want to go to the top level site of the site collection that's containing the host web, well, you have to go through the CSOM or REST endpoint, and you have to bring along an access token. Okay, so really there are 4 different possibilities. So we're going to look at it in 2 different ways. First way we'll look at it is, let's say that a call comes into SharePoint and it looks and sees, hey, there's a FedAuth token. This is a call where the user has already been authenticated. And if it's targeting the host web, basically just says, okay, well, authenticate as the user. If this user has permissions to do what the code's trying to do, that's great. It can succeed. If not, access denied. However, if there is a FedAuth token and SharePoint determines that the target URL of that CSOM or REST API call is an app web, it says, I know who the user is, but now I know who the app is. And it's able then to authenticate the app internally and basically set up the permissions for that. Now, if there is no FedAuth token, and this is going to be the case when you're writing server-side C# or VB.NET code, or some other crazy language, that's not .NET, but you're calling into the SharePoint host under the identity of an app, you have to create and bring along an access token and attach it in a special header that we'll look at a little bit later. And the idea is when SharePoint looks down there, it sees there's no FedAuth token. Is there an access token? Okay, there's an access token. It definitely is going to have app identity. And in most cases, it also has the user identity as well. But there's one special case when you're calling into SharePoint. If there's no current user, it's midnight and your app is running some batch processing, you want to call into SharePoint, or you're afraid that while your app has permissions to do something, the current user doesn't, you can basically pass in an access token with app-only identity. And the idea is that you can either call into SharePoint without any current user present, or you can call into SharePoint and elevate above the permissions of the current user. Okay, just to be clear, let's look at this one other way. Okay, so you're SharePoint. A CSOM or REST API call comes in. So you're saying, let's start the authentication process. Is there a FedAuth token? If there is a FedAuth token, does it target the app web? And it can just consult the list of app webs. It's got a mapping table inside there. If not, regular call, user authentication. If the user has permissions, the call succeeds. If it does target an app web, it can determine what app, and so then the call has both user and app identity. Okay, now, if it doesn't have a FedAuth token, the next question is, does it have an access token? If it has no access token, we can't authenticate, and if that endpoint doesn't allow anonymous access, it fails. Okay, but if there is an access token, we basically say, does the access token contain a user identity? If so, we set up the call context with both app and user identity. However, in that special scenario where you want app-only identity, it's going to set up the call context with app identity but not user identity. And one thing I want to call out here is that's only possible from server-side code. How do you elevate above the permissions of the current user from a SharePoint hosted app? You don't. It's not possible from client-side code. So one advantage that cloud-hosted apps have over is the ability to run without a user or to elevate above the permissions of the current user. But by default, SharePoint runs with both app and user identity. And for your call to succeed, the app needs the permission and the user needs the permission. It's not either or, it is both have to have it or the call will fail. And that's how the permissions model is set up. Okay, now let's get into requesting and granting app permissions. Now, it turns out that this next section that we're going to go through, requesting permissions, works the same way whether you're using internal or external authentication. So we're going to cover permissions now and then look at kind of the messy part, external authentication and access token management at the very end. Okay, so the way things work is that from the user permission perspective, there's no big changes from SharePoint 2010. So user permissions are generally managed at the site collection level, and there is this hierarchy of securable objects. And while we can micromanage and put an access control list on every single child site and every list item, generally we don't do that for many different reasons, but we have possibly just a single access control list at the top level site that dictates access control throughout the whole site collection. Okay, now also note with user permissions, you can also override anything that's configured at the site collection level by going to the web application and configuring user policy. Okay, so that's just a review of how things worked in SharePoint 2010, which is pretty much how user permissions work in SharePoint 2013. So it's app permissions that are new. A big mistake would be for you to say, I understand user permissions, so I therefore have a big leg up on understanding app permissions. There's nothing similar to how the access control lists are stored. There's no concept of a permissions hierarchy. Also, in the site collection level, all the access control lists are stored in the content database. So with app permissions, some are stored in the content database, but some can't be. Because a permission request can go beyond the scope of a site collection. It could basically be a tenancy-wide permission request. And what if those two different site collections don't live in the same content database? So behind the app service application, there's a database that basically stores the permissions that can't be managed at the content database level. Okay, not that any of that is important for being able to write the code and manage these things. Okay, now, the way that things work is by default, your app has full control over the app web. That's where you have private implementation details, do what you want. The only thing you might have to worry about is, has someone put a quota? So as I start putting video files inside there, my code blows up because I hit the quota limit of my app web. But other than that, you're free to do whatever you want inside the app web. Plus, what's nice about the app web is that you can also create lists and all kinds of things declaratively. But really, what you want to do in many cases, is to put things inside of the host web or some other site that's not the app web. And first of all, you have basically no permissions to do that, other than reading things like the title of your host web. And then secondly, you can't do anything declaratively. I think that's one of those things that Microsoft is going to get so much feedback saying, you got to be kidding. I got to create every single site column, every content type, every list using CSOM. Using CSOM and JavaScript? Oh my God. Okay, so everything has to be done via code, and everything has to be done after you have requested permissions and been granted those permissions to be able to do it. Now, the way things are going to work is that we have to add permission requests inside there. Okay. I've put that intentionally small to kind of not have you focus too much on the details of what's inside here. Okay. Yeah, right. Okay, so we have this permission designer. And the idea is that either I can use the permission designer to basically put permissions inside, or I can just edit the raw XML inside of the app manifest. You'll find that the permission designer is pretty good, but also when you work raw XML, the IntelliSense is pretty good for some things, but not as good for other things. But there are times where you actually have to go and do the raw edits to the XML. So a permission request is something that has this unique string, which is called a scope. And you have things like the product, which is generally going to be SharePoint, but it could also be Exchange or Link. And then you have the permission provider, which if you're just trying to access content inside of a site, it's the content provider. But then there's other permission providers for search, for metadata, for all the different service applications. And then there's going to be a target object at the end and some particular capability. Now, another thing to remember is that the designer doesn't know how to add this special thing, which is the allow app-only policy. So you're going to have to open up with raw XML and put that inside there in cases where you want app-only policy. And while it won't cause any problems in a SharePoint hosted app, it's frivolous to put it in there because it would never give you an opportunity to do anything different, since you cannot call in from a SharePoint hosted app with app-only policy. Okay, now I'm about to do the demo. And what's important to see is that if your app says, I want permissions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the user who's installing the app gets presented with a dialog saying, this app is requesting permissions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the user can't say, 2 looks kind of dangerous, I'll give you 1, 3, and 5. It's an all or nothing proposition. So apps never have to worry about, I got installed, but I only got a couple of permissions I requested. If the user says, I don't trust the app, it just short circuits the installation process. So once you get installed, you basically know that all the permissions that you requested have been granted, and you could basically make calls. Another thing to consider is that the user that's installing your app has to have the permissions before that user can grant them to your app. So a user has to be a site administrator to install your app. So if you just ask for permissions on the host web, the user's got them. But how about if you ask for permissions on the hosting site collection or the hosting tenancy? You might get into a situation where someone can install your app, but then can't grant the permissions that you want, which means the user really can't install your app. So you might kind of think about how many permissions that you want to ask. Don't ask for the world, because then the possibility of your app being installed is going to be compromised by users that would like to install your app, but they don't have the proper level of permissions. Okay, so let's go ahead and do another demo here. So with this particular demo, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of start with an app that is going to do something. And I better stop that guy right here. Once I've stopped him, I'll come back over and I'll open up, not Bob, but how about the app permissions demo? That sounds pretty good. Now, this app permissions demo, let's kind of start by looking at the app manifest, going to permissions, nada. And if I open this up right here and view this in code view, you can see that permission requests aren't there yet. But let's look at my code. So I go back, and there's really not much inside here other than a button and a div that my JavaScript is going to write into. I think the more you work in this environment, the more that you'll just find that creating all your HTML elements dynamically with JavaScript is the easiest way to go. Okay, so if you look at this piece of code right here, what this piece of code is going to do is it's going to say hello to all you nice folks, and it's going to hook up a command handler to a command button as the page loads in. And when I click that button, this code basically gets the URL, not necessarily to the host web, but to the top level site in the site collection where the host web exists. And then I'm going to try to make a simple call inside there using the REST API. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this guy right here. Now, as I run this, when you install an app, generally there is this very default set of permissions that they ask for. So I come up here and I haven't asked for anything explicitly. And so they're able to install my app. The first time that I might have installed that, they might have said, do you want this app to be able to access minimal permissions from the host web? But now we'll go here. Notice that we can get through, we can do all kinds of things. But as I click this right here, I get the access denied error. Okay, so how do I fix this particular problem? Well, I just have to know how to ask for the proper permission requests. So either through the XML, or in this case, what you're going to find is that this gets to be a very nice user interface to basically say, I want to get to my host web. I want permissions to read. As I go through here, read would basically say read information. There's also, when it comes to lists, write doesn't mean create lists. It means create list items. You need manage to be able to actually create lists and document libraries. But for this very simple demo, I'll just go ahead and pick read. If I go back here, you can see it just put this basic permission inside. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and try to install the app one more time. Note that there are a lot of issues that come up with permissions as you are testing and then stopping the debugger and starting again. So sometimes you might have to just through the browser take the app and remove it to basically clear out all the permissions. Because what you're going to find is sometimes you add permissions and then you want to try a reduced set of permissions, but it still caches the more full set of permissions. Okay, so here it's basically saying, do you trust this app? I say yes, and so right here is where SharePoint, in this case, is adding access control list entries into the content database for the current site collection. And what happens here is that when this app calls in, what's going to happen? It used internal authentication. It knows who the app is. It knows who the user is. Once it establishes both app and user identity, it looks through the access control list for apps and says, does this have permission to read something from the top level site? Yes, it does, and the call succeeds. Okay, so simple as pie. You guys ready to get to the tough stuff yet? Okay, so now what we want to do is talk about server-side code and how we manage access tokens. And what's unfortunate is that it works entirely different up in Office 365 as it does on premises. And I've heard certain people say, and you can write a cloud-hosted app that just works both in Office 365 and in on-premise. That is bunk. You're going to have, okay, do you have 50,000 lines of code or more? If you don't, I don't believe you. It's a lot of differences between those two different worlds. And I'm going to cover one of them. Okay. You want to call me as a fraud, Paul? Okay. What are you listening to on that iPod over there? Just kidding. Okay, so what is OAuth? OAuth is this internet protocol. Microsoft didn't invent it. Been up on the internet for a while. But the idea is that at the very beginning, we go back 5 or 10 years, and we had scenarios where you go to website 1, and website 1 says, hey, I'll go to website 2, and I'll get your pictures, and I'll bring them down, and I'll print them off and send them to you in the mail. Well, website 1 needs some way to get to website 2 and get permissions to your stuff. And in the early days, we would just basically give username and password. And then the app, website 1 would just connect to website 2 with my credentials. It would work. But then not only could it get the pictures, it could do anything it wanted. It could change my password. So we quickly found that just giving away our credentials to one website to access another website on our behalf wasn't good. So they created OAuth such that we could basically grant a reduced set of permissions and give website 1 a ticket, which it could use to go to website 2, not with my identity, but with the app's identity, with some set of permissions. So OAuth gives us the ability to authenticate apps, and it can also have tickets that carry permissions. And with SharePoint, we use it to authenticate apps, but we don't use it to carry permissions at all because we have OAuth and S2S and internal. And if we use permissions, that would be specific to OAuth. So basically, it just manages permissions using the exact same techniques that we just saw in that last thing inside there. Now, there's also one of the main creators of OAuth with 1.0. Don't remember the fellow's name, but he is a very passionate individual. And Microsoft and Google and a couple other players basically looked at OAuth 1.0 and said, this is too difficult. It might make your 200 IQ brain feel good, but we need mainstream developers to be able to use this. So they created 2.0, which kind of simplified some things. And the original creator walked away and said, this is ridiculous. I can't believe you're going to let people like Ted into this tent by making it so easy. Okay, but the key point here is that there's OAuth 1 and OAuth 2, and everything that SharePoint is doing is with the OAuth 2.0 specification. So the OAuth specification gives us details on how to create access tokens. Okay, now it's used for external authentication with Office 365, and it has a dependency on this thing that Microsoft has in the cloud, which is the Windows Azure Access Control Service, or ACS. And so your remote web is going to have to strike up a conversation with ACS and basically say, hey, give me an access token because I need to call into SharePoint and pass that along the way with it. And those access tokens have to be passed in every call with a special well-known header named authorization anytime it wants to call in to SharePoint and be authenticated as an app. Okay, so here are the players. There's you, the user. And you have a computer, maybe a mobile device, maybe a tablet. There is the Office 365 tenancy. So basically that's the SharePoint 2013 content server. There is Windows Azure ACS up in the cloud. And then there is the remote web, which we call the client app. Now, there's a lot of dyslexia. And that is client app. Sometimes we call it the client ID, sometimes we call it the app ID. It's the same thing. Sometimes we call it the client secret, sometimes we call it the app secret. It's the same thing. So just realize that the terminology in the Microsoft documentation just keeps jumping back and forth between client and app. Now, even though you're going to create an access token, you're going to call into SharePoint. Before you do that, you need to create this special thing, which is an app principal, or sometimes called the app security principal. Now, the app security principal, once it gets registered, makes the app via an ID well known to both Office 365 and Windows Azure ACS. And when you register an app principal, you need the client ID, aka the app ID, which is a GUID identifier. There is a client secret, or the app secret, and that is a base 64 encoded string that's used to encrypt and decrypt data. And the idea is that your remote web and ACS need to exchange secrets back and forth. And the idea is that if your app has the secret and Windows Azure ACS has the secret and your identity, it can create data, encrypt it, send it to you, and basically you can decrypt it because you have the app secret. And then you can do the same thing. You can create something, you can encrypt it, you can send it in, and Windows Azure ACS knows that it came from you and is expecting that you didn't get compromised and you let the bad guy have your client ID and client secret. There is the app host domain, which is basically going to be just the URL, which points to the remote web. So as we register the app principal, we have to know where the calls are going to be coming from on the network. And then there's this special case parameter, which is called the redirect URL. I'm not going to get into that just for time restrictions on the talk. But the short story on the redirect URL, it's for requesting permissions on the fly for things that don't even have to be registered or installed as SharePoint apps. Okay, now, we're going to go through the protocol. And what we're going to see is that there are quite a few different security tokens. There's one that ACS will create, which is called the context token. Within the context token, ACS adds another thing called the refresh token. And the idea is the context token gets passed to you in the remote web, and you can pull the refresh token out of the context token, and the refresh token is good for 6 months. So you could store it in a database. But the important thing about the refresh token is that's what you pass to ACS when you want it to pass you back an access token. And then the last thing which is the special case that I'm not going to get into. The authorization code is a special type of token that's handed back by sites that are requesting permissions on the fly. Okay, now let's go through this whole piece right here. And so maybe before we do that, let's go back and do the demo. My demo slide's coming in a little bit, but let's create an auto-hosted app. One thing that's neat about the auto-hosted app is you don't have to pre-register the app security principal, because Office 365 just does it on the fly for you. So here, we'll create an app. Okay, and this one is going to be Paul 2.0. And as I create this one, this time I'll leave it with the default, which is AutoHosted App. Okay. So once again, I don't have to do anything just to get Hello World working. They give me a form. And then back here, if I kind of take a look at this code, you can see that they put the Hello World code in place right here to make a CSOM call back to the host web to basically get the title and just basically push it out on the start page of this auto-hosted app. Now, before I hit F5, let's go look at the web.config file. I look at the web.config file, and the client ID has to be a GUID. That's blank at first. And so typically in a provider-hosted app, you've created the GUID, you've registered the app security principal, and then you have the GUID inside here, everything's ready to go. What's kind of neat about this is that Office 365 is going to create this ID on the fly as it installs and creates the remote web for the auto-hosted app, and then it passes back information to Visual Studio, so it can basically just patch this thing up. Okay. If I go ahead and I look over at the app manifest, in this case right here, what you can see is that if you have a provider-hosted app, you have to add the GUID inside there. But with an auto-hosted app, you don't know the GUID because Office 365 creates it on the fly. Okay, so let's go ahead and start this thing up right here. I go ahead and I start this thing up. We cross our fingers. We pray to the great demo god up above. I do not stay out like Eric Schups. Forgive me for I have sinned. Okay. Inside joke. Okay, so now we wait for this thing to get inside here. And if I come back over here, what we're going to see along the way is that it's automatically registering the app security principal for me. It's going to fill that detail in at the end. But what we want to do is we kind of want to look at the communications that are going on between the various parties that are involved. Okay, now I'll give this just a couple more seconds. Hopefully we'll come back and deployment succeeded, which is generally what we want, unless we're being paid by the hour. Okay, go ahead and say trust it, but before, well, I'll go ahead and say trust it. And now it's going to go there. Hey, that's great, but let's go back here. And now let's kind of see what the user would see inside here. And at the same time, let's bring up one of my best friends, probably soon to be one of your best friends, Fiddler. Okay. So what we want to see is actually the communication, that is going back and forth. And so let's go back here. Let's go to the site contents page. I go back to the site contents page, and there's this thing which is called a app launcher. If I go back here, take a look at what happened inside here. Now, what Fiddler can't do is Fiddler can't see the communications between Office 365 and Windows ACS. It's not on my machine. You have to get the enterprise version of Fiddler. That's just a joke. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to the slides and kind of walk through what's happened so far. If I can find my slides. Okay, so for that app launcher to be there, what happens is, first of all, I had to authenticate against Office 365. And they created a FedAuth token with my user identity. Now, in order to create that app launcher, what happens is Office 365 calls into Windows Azure ACS, realize that the app security principal has already been registered. And so Windows Azure has the client secret. It also knows the client ID. And so what Office 365 asks ACS to do is says, please build a special token known as a context token. And when you build it, make sure it's specific to this tenancy ID, this particular site collection, this site, and this particular user. So those things all get baked into the context token, which gets passed back here, gets passed back here. Okay, now the idea is, at this point, here's the user sitting here. Okay, just to make things a little bit more clear, let's go back and clear this out. Okay, I know what you're thinking, my love for fiddlers unnatural. Okay, come from the United States, we have different principles. Okay, so anyway, we go ahead and click inside here. And so what we can see here is that now there's this ongoing conversation. And so what happens is the first thing that happens is that it posts to my local machine right here. And if I come down here and I look at the, headers that are coming inside here, what you're going to be able to see is that there's this big thing, which is the context token inside there. Okay, now where is my context token? Tunnel to SharePoint.com. Coming inside here. Okay, actually, I'm not able to figure that out, but let's go back here and kind of see, the communications now, between my remote web, which is basically running out of a Visual Studio debugging process here on my development machine, and that's able to make these calls. And so right here, here's kind of the entry points, that are calling inside here. And what you can see is that they return basically this access token inside. Okay, so just kind of the dance that's going on is when you click on that app launcher, it basically posts into your start page and it passes the context token as a form variable. And the context token can be basically taken, and inside of that you can retract or basically extract the refresh token. Now, if you're working with PHP or some non-SharePoint technology or non.NET technology, you're going to have to work at a very low level to understand these things. When you work with .NET in Visual Studio, we're going to use a friendly library that we're going to make a call, and it's going to pull the refresh token out, and then it's going to pass the refresh token over to ACS, which is then going to pass back the access token. Okay, then with the access token, we can make calls into SharePoint. And the access token gets attached to this special header, and I'll show you how that's going to be set up. But the idea is we can call back into SharePoint, and as long as we have requested the proper permissions and the app can authenticate, you can call in with CSOM or the REST API and do what you need to do to the host web or the host site collection or the host tenancy. And you can make calls in, get data back. Maybe you'll go in, find data from a particular list, get it back as a XML or a JSON result and build an HTML table. And then you could basically return a page from the remote web back to the user showing an interface that you've created from content that was inside of SharePoint. Okay, so now that we've seen that flow, let's look at some of the things that we have inside here. Okay, now inside here, let's say that, let me go ahead and close this down right here. And now that I close this down, there's going to be one more demo that we're going to look at before we end. So there's this special class, which is called the Token Helper class. And the idea is whenever you create a cloud-hosted app project, which is either going to be a AutoHosted app or a provider-hosted app, it creates two Visual Studio projects, one for the app itself, and remember the app itself is just going to have the app manifest and an icon for it, and some little marketing plug right there. Okay, and then down below here, what we have is we have a project based on ASP.NET 4.0, and it has many things, the web.config, but also this token helper class. Now, probably the easiest thing as you're trying to get up to speed on the token helper class is look at it in class view. And if you look at this thing inside of class view, what you're going to see, is quite a few methods inside here. Okay, now, to me, this token helper class, Microsoft, spent 98% of its time making sure that the Office 365 story worked. And, oh, we're about to ship. Have we really worried about the S2S scenario? So unfortunately, Paul had to kind of tell you the poor man's story because there's a lot more functionality here for dealing with OAuth than there is for S2S. Well, also OAuth, you're up in Office 365, the identity and the structured security tokens are well known inside there. In on-premises farms, you can use Windows Auth, you can use FBA, you can basically bootstrap in all kinds of other identity providers. So unfortunately, when you get to the S2S case, only straight Windows Auth is supported out of the box, and you have to add extra code to the token helper class if you want to deal with FBA, or if you are having SAML 1.0 tokens that are hitting SharePoint before they create the Fed auth token. Okay, and at some point this has to come out, but what we really like is security systems where things just work. How about a security system where it's not really done, so we're going to have junior engineer Jimmy, who's learning about security principles, create the code to secure our app as we're going. And unfortunately, that's, to some degree, kind of where we're at. Why is the token helper class not baked into a DLL? Well, then I guess the SharePoint team would have to support it. It's just basically added in by Visual Studio. So I think this is just the kind of the rough edges of a 1.0 release that are definitely going to get better with time. But one of my points here is, don't have junior engineer Jimmy being the one that extends the token helper class, when that has to be done. You want your best people that really can read security specs and understand what they're all about and do, very thorough testing before you're going to put any of this code into production. Okay. Now, that being said, let's go back to my slides. And when I finally get back to my slides, that I know they're somewhere here. So what are the steps to using Office 365 with a cloud-hosted app where we want to use OAuth? Well, we have to create the new cloud-hosted app project. Only in the simple case where you have an auto-hosted app and you don't care about publishing to the Office store, can you get away with just having the app principal registered behind the scenes. If you want a provider-hosted app, you're going to have to go and you're going to have to explicitly register the app principal, either through the SharePoint browser UI or through PowerShell. Or if you're going to be working with apps that you want to publish in the Office store, there's additional hoops that we have to jump through. Now, I've already done that particular demo, so let's get to the last section. There are some built-in pages in SharePoint 2013. They're not linked to, so you have to kind of just type them in inside the browser. But there's the app reg new, the app inv, and the app principal.ispx. Also note that in Office 365, there is a set of PowerShell commandlets that you can download onto your machine that can then create a connection to your Office 365 tenancy. So you can do your user management and your app principal management all through PowerShell, which I would prefer to do, just so we're not doing it by hand and making it error prone. Here's what the app reg new page looks like. And the idea is you go to this particular page, and as you go to this particular page, let's go back to my tenancy inside here. And so if I make this a little bit bigger inside, app reg new.aspx, and there's that particular page. I need an app ID. I either ring my own GUID or I click generate. App secret. Can you create a base 64 encoded string in Notepad? Maybe, maybe not. If not, just go ahead and click on this and it will generate one for you. but then you put your title, you put your app domain inside here. So you can either use this user interface, or you can basically just use the PowerShell commandlets in your local on-premises farm to do the same thing, or those special SharePoint Online PowerShell commandlets to do the same thing, up inside of the Office 365 environment. Once you click OK, it comes back and says, we've registered that. Now we've basically put some things, into, not only the app services database behind Office 365, but also, there's traces of the identity that have to be pushed into Windows Azure ACS. There's the app inventory page. If you come up with a app ID and you say lookup, it can basically tell you if that's inside there or not. What I'll say is that they should have done a little bit more work to give us a better UI. So I think really just getting up to speed on the PowerShell management of app security principles, to me, is just a requirement because you're limited. You can't see all the app security principles. You can basically see all the app security principles that have been assigned permissions. But you have a case where you have a dangling one that you don't see on the app principles page, and you can't add the same one in because it's already there. But if you use PowerShell, you can see everything and manage everything a lot more clearly. You guys want to go home? Unfortunately for them, I have a very loud voice. Okay, just a couple more slides. But there's other things you have to do up in the seller dashboard to register things and have Microsoft put an approval stamp on it, before you're going to be able to, register an app security principle that you can then use in an app that people are going to install from the Office store. Okay, just a couple other things here. There's what your app manifest looks like in an auto-hosted app. However, in a provider-hosted app, we're going to have to add the remote web application client ID inside there. Okay. And then in the web.config file for both, you have to have the client ID and the client secret. And if you take a lower level look at things like what does the okay. I want to do just one more quick demo here. I promise I'll be done in 4 minutes. And if not, I apologize for lying in advance. But what I did is I wrote this little sample app. I wrote it for the SharePoint conference. But the idea is that when we post into the app itself, I wanted to create just an educational app so that you can kind of see what data is coming in to the start page of your remote web and how we deal with that type of data inside there. Oh, so now they cut my microphone, now they cut my internet connection. Okay. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. I'm not kidding, I'm kidding. These audio people are great. I'm the guy who's being kind of a jerk. Okay, so anyway, when they call your start page, what they do is they pass a form variable, which is the SP app token, which is a 64, base 64 encoded string, which you can decrypt and basically see what your context token looks like. Your context token is really just a JavaScript object notation token that has various pieces of information inside there. And in many cases, you don't have to do anything because you're just going to use simple methods in the security, in the token helper class, which is going to deal with all this stuff behind the scenes. However, there are ways that you can pull out certain things from the context token. Like what is the realm? What's the ID of the hosting tenancy? Who is the user? When is it valid from? And what you'll see is that context tokens are valid for 12 hours, but inside there is a refresh token that's valid for 6 months. There's also this thing called the cache key. And the idea is you don't want to take a context token for Bob the user, cache it, and then use it for Mary the user, because you're going to be calling in back into SharePoint with Bob's identity, not Mary's identity. So if you're going to have a complex caching scheme, which is only important for OAuth, in Paul's lecture talking about S to S, we just create those things on the fly, and there's no need for caching. But in Office 365, there's a huge need for caching, but you have to start thinking about who am I caching this for? So the cache key is unique per combination of tenancy ID, site ID, and user ID. And the idea is if you have either in-memory dictionaries or in a database, you can just stick the refresh token there and use the cache key as your ID. And then later, you can see the cache key. Do I have that in storage? If not, go ahead and get another access token. The access token itself has interesting information to SharePoint, but maybe not so much to you. And the idea with the access token is generally we're going to take it, and if you see things like this up here, if you look at, we have token helper, get access token, and that gives you back the access token. We have get app only access token. Now there's two things we have to do. We have to make CSOM calls and we have to make REST calls. It turns out that REST is the harder one because you have to explicitly add the access token as a special header. And so the idea is once you have the access token, what we can do to make a REST call is we're going to go ahead and create one of these new HTTP web requests, and then we're going to take the access token string and we're going to add it as a special named header authorization and then bearer space access token string. And then once you've done that to your HTTP web request, you can basically start making REST calls with the assurance that it's passing the right authorization header with the information that SharePoint can use to authenticate your app. When it comes to CSOM calls, things are a lot easier because they have this special method which is called get client context with access token, which basically creates a client context that automatically has set up the token. So once you've done that, it's just CSOM programming as usual, and the calls just succeed inside there. Okay, so we went through a lot of stuff inside there. My apologies for going a little bit over, and my fake insults to the technical staff here, which are very good, obviously. They're really good at understanding my humor. Anyway, I'd be happy now that we're kind of done for the day. Anyone who wants to come up here, I will talk, and explain anything else that I failed to do. But other than that, make sure you check out Critical Path Training. Other than that, thanks for attending. Hope you're having a good conference.